The Metanexus Institute is a global network of scholars, scientists, clergy, and citizens pursuing the constructive engagement of science, religion, philosophy, and the humanities. At colleges, universities, and their communities around the world, we promote interdisciplinary, interinstitutional, and interreligious exploration and education. For more information, visit www.metanexus.net.
We are going to have now our second speaker, Professor Carreira. I introduced him to you at the beginning, but in order to be brief, I skipped two important achievements included in his CV, which are quite meaningful for his talk. He was invited to become adjunct astronomer of the Vatican Observatory, Castel Gandolfo. He taught a course of galaxies to 20 bishops in 1991 in celebration of the centennial of the observatory and cooperated in 12 international summer courses. He has been a member of the board of directors of the Vatican Observatory for 15 years. He has had lecture tours at university in 7 Latin American countries, sponsored by the Vatican. So, Professor Carreira.
Thank you very much. The first thing I would like to say is that the title of my talk, as it appears at least in some of the programs, missed one syllable. The title should be The Human Person, Nature, Ethical, and Theological Viewpoints. And in some programs it says, and logical viewpoints. That extra syllable has a meaning, because I think that the concept of person is central, both when talking about humanity and also when talking about theology and even about the universe itself. The fact that we talk about human person and not simply person already suggests that there might be other persons besides the human person. And that is exactly the content of the theological viewpoints that I will develop. First, we need to establish the concept of person. And we should do this by means of philosophical considerations that go beyond the physical parameters that we can measure in an experiment. No experiment can determine that something is a person. We use the term in everyday life, and we seem to be clear about what it means, even if we don't define it explicitly. We understand that the person is not simply a thing, and so we do not call persons inanimate objects, and we cannot call persons normally either other living things here on earth. But it includes the idea of life. A person, first, is a source of activity that is self-originated and that shows a spontaneity that is not found in mere physical structures, following physical laws. Even so, the fact that a person is a living entity has to be restricted. We do not call a person a microbe, an insect, a fish. We don't speak about animals as persons, except perhaps in some kind of poetic, let's say, story for children, where animals are supposed to talk and to behave as we do. We do not take that seriously. A person, therefore, is encountered in our experience only in human beings. Something new is present in the way man acts. And there is a common root of self-appreciation, of culture, which implies science, the humanities, even religions, and the structure of society at all levels. This basic and common root we call human rationality. And this is the definition we give of a human being, is a rational animal. The specific difference is rational. Thus, we define a person in terms of an activity that shows that ends are freely sought after being known as concepts that imply information which goes beyond the data of the senses. Rationality is expressed and realized in a constant search for truth, beauty, and goodness. And this is a multiple activity that corresponds to the two powers of the human mind and will. Knowledge, in this case, is not a mere reaction to an external stimulus. That is sensory knowledge, and it is found also in animal life throughout the entire range of animals, from cells to man. But intelligence is rather a process where the data, even from the senses, are consciously analyzed to obtain from them ideas that have a universal value, to obtain inferences or deductions that go beyond direct experience. A person is conscious of multiple possibilities, possibilities of representing reality and of acting. And the person looks for the best explanation of facts and for the consequences of various courses of action, whether those courses are ends in themselves or means for other ends. This means that the activity is subjected to a judgment of value. And so the human activity embodies purpose and free choice. Because of this, we apply to the person's activity the categories of truth and error in the level of knowledge, and of goodness, suitability that presupposes ends and means in accordance with the nature of things, the nature of the agent and the nature of the ends that are sought. Therefore, the philosophical concept of nature expresses the essence of a given reality, the human reality, insofar as it is the sufficient reason for activities. Acting should be tied to what the agent is. In philosophy, we define nature as the essence of a given being, considered as the source of its activity. We apply this idea also in science when we talk about matter at any level. We know what things are because of what they do. And our laboratory experiments, by detecting activity, identify the source of the activity as an electron or a proton or something else. And unnatural behavior has a connotation of error. If something appears in an experiment that doesn't fit what an electron is, then we would say that the identification of the agent as an electron was wrong. The same is true in the activities of a human person. Something unnatural is considered wrong, is considered unfitting, and that is the source of the judgments of right and wrong. That is the basis of moral judgments and also of the concepts of rights and duties, both at the personal level and also in the context of society. Only the person can be the subject of rights and duties, strictly speaking. Only the person is responsible for acts that can be considered right or wrong. In our known universe, only the human being has the power to know and choose in this way. In our experience, we don't find persons at any other level except humanity. Even if animals show wonderful behavior, we know that their acting cannot be attributed to a free choice arising from a conscious and free selection of alternative paths of behavior. We know that there is a genetic program that is coupled with conditioned responses from experience, and that program rules animal activity. Because of that, we don't consider that animals are ever bound by duties, and they cannot be the subject of corresponding rights. But we can be bound by duties towards animals and towards nature in general. That, yes. Summing up then, we can say that the human animal is a person because human activity includes new concerns due to intellectual powers and free will. So I want to stress that intelligence is not a new way of acting. It is a new way of knowing. And from this new way of knowing, then actions are determined by a free choice with respect to some end that the person wants to achieve. Because this activity is not automatically predetermined, man is accountable for his acts and is judged ethically good or evil. Still, we do have also a genetic program, and we do have instincts. So the human person has something in common with every other human or a non-human life on Earth, but it has something more. And the relationship between the source of rational activity and the source of biological activity is what we call the mind and body problem. We have two levels of activity, and they belong to the same subject, to the same agent, and then we have to understand our personhood from the different viewpoints to inquire about its origin, its consequences at the individual level and also at the social level. To understand this fully, one would need a panel of experts in biology, metaphysics, ethics, theology, and history to understand how the human person was incorporated in different cultures, in codes of law, in patterns of behavior. And from biology, we would clarify the role of bodily structures, of genetic programming, of conditioning, of possible malfunctions at the organic level that influence also on human behavior. From physical and metaphysical considerations, we have to establish a sufficient reason for the traits that define a person. We have to find the basis for the concepts of right and duties, of human dignity and responsibility. We can then extend those ideas to theology to talk about personal relationships of human beings with a personal creator. A creator who is at the same time the first source of being and the final end that constitutes our eternal destiny. how those ideas have appeared in different cultures through human history is a very interesting field of research and knowledge, but we cannot make our reasoning depend upon any kind of democratic consensus or traditional views. We have to study the concepts in their full implications, both for our personal behavior and for our social activities. As is obvious from biology, we are part of the tree of life on Earth. This is the only place where we have data and where scientific studies are possible. To talk about other life forms outside the Earth is to speak in science fiction. We are not going to learn anything by positing the possibilities of other forms of life anywhere. We only have data about human life here on Earth and any kind of life here on Earth. We know that there is an intimate relationship between all living things, from cells to man, with the same basic chemistry based on carbon compounds in a liquid medium, which has to be water. Scientists time and again underline that the only element in the periodic table that is capable of producing the macromolecules needed for DNA and the transmission of the genetic code are the molecules based on carbon. And the only liquid capable of being liquid in a range of temperatures compatible with the chemistry of carbon compounds is water. And water has also the unique property of being less dense in the solid state than in the liquid, thus making life possible, because otherwise the oceans and rivers and lakes would freeze, the ice would fall to the bottom, they would freeze again, it would fall again to the bottom, and finally there would be no liquid at all to sustain life. And a solid cannot be a living thing, because it has no flexibility to interact with the environment without destroying itself. Just look at what happens to a crystal of common salt. If you put it in a humid atmosphere, it reacts with the environment, but it destroys itself. So we have the same common chemistry, the same physical and chemical basis for life, from the first cell to man. During the story of life on Earth, 5 great extinction events have eliminated approximately 90% of all living forms. There are no indications that life arose more than once. All living things on Earth have the same chirality. If there are 2 molecules that have exactly the same chemical components, but one has the symmetry of the right hand, the other one of the left hand, they have the same ability to react, but life only uses one of the 2 forms throughout the entire history of known life on Earth. So we are entitled to say that there was a single start for life. If there were others, they didn't survive, and that we are therefore closely connected to every other living form on Earth from the biological viewpoint. But the 2 questions that cannot be answered by biology are, first, how do we begin to have life, a cell, from inanimate matter? And the second one, how do we explain the step from non-intelligent to intelligent life? At the moment, there are no answers from biology to either of those questions. We can say that life has to start using the properties of matter, and life develops also using the properties of matter. but nobody can give a real explanation for how the first cell ever developed. In fact, a known scientist who died not too many years ago, Sir Fred Hoyle, said that it was so impossible to explain that life would begin spontaneously that he thought that he didn't do it here on Earth, that he did it some other place where we don't know what conditions obtained, and then it came to Earth. That, of course, is not answering the problem at all. It is just hiding it where one can't see it. So we do not know when or where or how life first started. We know that there are indications of living material in sedimentary rocks from about 3.5 billion years ago. Billion in the sense of American billions, which are 1,000 million. So from 3,500 million years ago, we have sedimentary rocks with carbon material that is attributed to living organisms, single cells. We do not know how the DNA code could develop by chance. The calculations show that in order to obtain by chance the genetic code that we have and that primates have, you would have a chance, one chance in 10 to 126. And that is a rather conservative estimate, because other estimates go to 10 to the 250th power. Even if every atom and particle in the universe were producing 1 million combinations every second, you wouldn't have a chance yet to have the DNA code by sheer chance. So the fact that we exist at all depends upon a most improbable series of events. At the atomic level, you have to have the right properties of carbon, of water, of all the other elements. At the chemical level, you have to have the right environment for all those processes based on carbon chemistry to take place. At the genetic level, you have the tremendous, improbable coming together of all those atoms to produce the DNA code. And then you have 5 great extinction events along the history of life on Earth, and if any of those had not occurred when it did, we wouldn't be here. The latest great extinction event, 65 million years ago, was the disappearance of the dinosaurs. And as long as they were the kings here on Earth, mammals had no chance to develop at all. And they were the dominant life form for 65 million years. So they could be still around if a large meteorite, a mini asteroid of 10 kilometers diameter, had not contributed to their demise, falling in the Caribbean, where we still find underwater the big crater of about 150 kilometers diameter caused by that impact. Once we have a free field for mammals, we have the development of primates, and for instance, 3 million years ago, approximately, you find in Laetoli in Africa, on volcanic cinders, you find the imprint of some living thing walking on 2 feet, and that is an indication already of a primate that had the basic structure that we still see in all primates today and also in man. When does man appear? In order to be man, you have to establish that there is intelligence and free will. This obviously cannot be deduced from observing a bone. We only are sure of intelligence when we find indications of this search for truth, beauty, and goodness that defines rationality. We find the search for truth when we see that there is a choice of materials to make a bow and arrow, a choice of materials to make a stone axe. We find the search for beauty when we encounter caves with beautiful paintings, with carvings, even in some cases with something that could be a primitive flute, a musical instrument. We find the search for goodness when we encounter burials, which imply the care even for the dead, and therefore some kind of concern about an afterlife. When we find the bones that were cut in order to relieve the pressure in somebody's head, you find trepanning evidence in some skulls in different places of the world, and the bone healed to fill the hole, something that would require months of care for somebody who would be totally unable to care for himself. So we have the properties of rationality evident in those early humans searching for truth, for beauty and goodness. Then we have to ask ourselves, how do you get this? How do you get this new level of activity? How do you explain those concerns? Can they be explained simply by environmental pressure and survival of the fittest? Does a painting in a cave keep you more protected from the cold or from the beasts that roam around? No. Can burying somebody give you any advantage? Instead of eating the dead person, perhaps? Why do you put valuable things with a burial that are difficult to make and that are highly appreciated, and they put them there to accompany the dead in their new life? We are not talking about the pressure of the environment. We are not talking about survival of the fittest here. When you care for somebody incapable of caring for himself during months, what is the advantage on that? So we have to say that there is a new level of activity, and this either has to be explained in terms of physical laws that define matter, or you have to look for another source of activity aside from matter. In physics, we define things for what they do. Operational definitions. And in physics today, nobody admits anything but 4 forces as sources of activity: gravitational, electromagnetic, weak nuclear, and strong nuclear. Nothing else. So we define matter as saying that it is everything and only that which has some possibility of acting through at least one of those 4 forces. This all-encompassing definition includes particles, energy, the physical vacuum, space and time. All that is matter. And all physical activity occurs in the environment of space and time. And all physical activity is subjected to conservation laws. The most elementary one says that in no physical process appears anything out of nothing or is anything reduced to nothing. All physical activity simply changes one state into another, but it does not add anything totally new, and it does not diminish the amount of reality that is there to begin with. Now, if the activity that defines the human person is going to be attributed to matter, I have the right and the duty to ask which one of those forces produces a thought. Which one of those forces produces an act of free will? And of course, there is no answer there. No physical law can produce a single thought. There are electrical activities in the brain when we think, just as there is electrical activity in a TV set when I am watching a movie. But the contents of information, the fact that the movie is entertaining or boring, is not determined by the electrical currents. The electrical currents are only the means to convey information, but the electrical currents do not produce the information. Just as paper and ink are the way to convey information in a printed page, but the ink and the cellulose of the paper do not explain the literary value or the informational content of the page. So if matter, defined as physics defines it, cannot explain abstract thought and cannot explain free will, then I cannot attribute those two activities to matter. And this is the source then that we have to accept exists in man. There has to be a new reality that is not reducible to matter, that does not act through the four forces that we said, and this new source is therefore non-material, and that is what we call the human spirit. There is no reasonable way out of this argument, even if one invents all kind of high-sounding phrases like that when you have a lot of neurons tied together, then intelligence emerges spontaneously. That is just pure gibberish. Intelligence cannot emerge unless it is submerged first someplace. And no amount of electrical currents can explain even what a computer does. When you have a computer just made in the factory and you plug it in, it doesn't do anything unless somebody introduces a program. And the program is not a set of electrical forces. The program has to be decided to produce an effect by means chosen by the programmer, using, yes, electrical forces, but with symbols and with contents that are not meant to remain at the level of electrical currents, but to convey information and to do something for a purpose. The same is true then in the human being. We need to accept that there is something more than matter in man. And this cannot come from chemical reactions along the path of evolution from cell to man. Matter only produces matter, and all material changes produce only material results. but they cannot produce a thought, and they cannot produce an act of free will. Therefore, the only source that one has as a logical possibility for this spiritual element in man is a creating spirit, who is also free from the constraints of matter, who is also personal. And the proper activity of the spirit is precisely to know in abstract, not only through the senses, and to act with free will for a purpose. This means then that in man there is a duality, two sources of two levels of activity, but in a single subject. We do not accept a dualism that would make man a temporary, accidental joining of matter and spirit. We are a single subject, and the same person is the one that says, I am going to take a walk and I am going to study the theory of relativity. And the same person is the subject for both acts. Thus, we cannot reduce man to either of the two elements. I don't think there are too many people who want to reduce man to just spirit and deny the body. But there seem to be quite a number who want to deny the spirit and accept only the body. No, I am not conscious of my brain. I am not conscious of anything within my skin. If I were to deny something, I would deny the body, but I would not deny the mind that is knowing that I exist. That is the famous phrase by Descartes. I think, therefore I am. Even if I doubt, I cannot deny that I am doubting. I am conscious of, first of all, my own activity at that level. It has been tried to put human will and freedom at the level of quantum mechanics and say perhaps that in some microtubules, in some cells in the brain, you have the indeterminacy principle leading to freedom. That is total nonsense. Freedom is anything but random. Freedom is anything but just a chance event. Freedom is the conscious choice of a way of acting after considering the different possibilities and their possible outcomes. So there is nothing random there. We know ourselves intimately only at that level. To know our own body, we have to use the same methodology that we need to know the body of any other living thing on earth. But we know, naturally, that we are a single person, and we cannot accept as a reason for our rationality a just because that doesn't satisfy even a child. Why do we think? The fact that we think is not in question. We have to find a sufficient reason for it. In this respect, a little over 2 years ago, I was giving a lecture in the philosophy department in the university in Barcelona, and a lady came after the lecture and told me, I am beginning the courses in philosophy, and I have a 10-year-old child who is always pestering everybody, asking why, and this why, and why, and why. He said a few days ago, an uncle of his was visiting, and the child was again asking. And finally we told him, look, that is enough. And he stopped for a moment, and then he said, And why do I have to be always asking why? Well, this is the expression of this need to find truth. And no answer is satisfactory if it is just given as a just because. No, that doesn't satisfy even a child. Once we have the data then from our environment and we analyze the data, we look for patterns, relationships of order, of beauty. And this is the source, for instance, of the pleasure that one finds even in a mathematical formula. One sees the beauty of a simple relationship that has all kinds of consequences that are then to be developed in different fields of science, like, for instance, the gravitational law of Newton. One finds patterns in colors, in shapes, in sizes, and one finds a special pleasure in finding beauty, a pleasure that is totally independent of any economic or survival value. I can enjoy a sunset, but I don't have to own it, and I don't have to say that that does anything for me to my health or to my survival. I enjoy a flower the same. This is part of the ability of looking for order in things. And the entire development of science is precisely the search for order in all the myriad impressions that we get through the senses and in the laboratory. And finally, we have the search for goodness when we know something as a desirable end and we look for a way to obtain it. This then has now some consequences that I will try to develop very briefly. First, the ethical consequences of the human personality means that we have rights and duties, some with respect to our own activity as a personal level, and other activities that impinge upon other members of the human family. And all members of the human family are basically equal in the sense of being persons and of having the same rights and duties due to their nature. The right to seek freedom of inquiry, the right to search for truth, means that one cannot accept any kind of brainwashing or of imposition of theories or imposition of political views or any other type of forcing the way one looks for truth. It implies also the right to an education for all human beings at a level adequate for their environment. We have the right to sustenance, to health care, to all the material goods that are needed to develop the individual, both physically and culturally. And society has to enact the laws that ensure that this is the case for all citizens. International bodies are legitimately entitled to regulate commerce, travel, exchange of information, so that everybody will have an equal opportunity to develop as a full human being. At the UN, Pope John Paul II stressed this: society is for the individual, not the other way around. There is nothing more precious in the world than a human person. In 1948, the Declaration of Human Rights, signed by the members of the UN, stressed this, affirming that every human being, just because of having this dignity as a person, is entitled to the full respect of those duties, or those rights with duties consequential upon them, that begin with the right to life at all stages of existence, for health care, for the full use of that intelligence and free will. The person can never be reduced to the level of a thing useful for somebody else, as in the case of slavery, or even for the state, as in the case of totalitarian regimes. Laws that ignore this are not legally binding. They have to be resisted. And that is why in Nuremberg, nobody who contributed to the massacre of Jews in the concentration camps was exonerated because he was just obeying laws. No. To obeying unjust law is never correct, even at the cost of death. Because this is a pattern of living that has to occur in a society, we have to talk about different cultures through history, and those cultures many times are presented with a general statement that all cultures are equally respectable. I have heard this many times, and nobody ever, in my experience, started by the obvious thing, which is defining the word culture. Culture is not a way of building houses or of making clay pots or of decorating a house. Those are cultural manifestations. But the culture of a society is a set of ideas that are the ones that give sense to their activities, that give sense to the proper behavior of the individual and of society with respect to others and even with respect to a final end. This set of ideas might or might not be correct if it does not respect the equal value of all human beings. That culture has no right to exist. One does not have to accept as valuable a culture based, for instance, on human sacrifices or on the practice of slavery or in the denial of rights to a caste or a gender. Those cultures that conculcate the dignity of persons do not have a right to be respected. We have to accept, therefore, that there has to be an equal right for every person to develop the fullness of that dignity, and the governments have the duty to make sure that that is the case. Finally, I will add a few words about the theological considerations of personhood. And the first philosophical and theological consideration is the creator of the universe has to be a personal being, has to know what he can create, has to have a purpose for creating, and the purpose for an infinite God to create is not going to be entertaining himself by seeing how stars burn, or entertaining himself by seeing how lizards scurry through the ground. The only sufficient reason for creation is the establishment of personal relationships with other beings capable also of knowing and acting freely, who will recognize the depth of gratitude to the Creator and will eventually be destined to participate of a new life, partaking of his happiness. Within Christian theology, the concept of person appears then in a new and more profound light when we are told in Revelation that this creating God is an only God with only one will and one mind, but with three persons sharing completely, totally, equally that one mind and will. We do not understand it, but we accept it as something that we have been told by the infinite truth, and we have a reason, therefore, to accept it, even if we don't understand it. Let's remember that we don't understand quantum mechanics either, and we don't understand ourselves. On the other hand, the incarnation is also another point where the concept of person has to be enlarged. Christ is only one person, and that is a divine person. But he is also a man. He has two natures. He has two wills and two minds, but he is one only person. We don't understand that either. Finally, in our own resurrection, we are told that the totality of the human person, body and soul, will begin to exist outside of the limits of space and time. That is the word or the phrase that the Catechism of the Catholic Church in the number 645 applies to the resurrection. It is a new way of existing outside of space and time. Therefore, outside of the workings of physical laws, immune to decay, immune to material needs. The human person is finally the crown of creation, the most wonderful thing, and in Christ we have the divine person who is also man, and there even matter itself is carried now to the throne of the divinity. Thank you very much.